to celebrate, the museum traditionally holds a series of archaeology-themed lectures. Tonight is the first of 3 that we're going to have in the next, tonight and then next Friday night and the following night. If you have a museum program guide, you'll be able to follow who's coming, who's going, and what the topics are. But tonight, I'm delighted to introduce a rising star among Pacific Northwest archaeologists, Dr. Shannon Tushingham, who's an assistant professor of anthropology at Washington State University. We're not going to hold that against you tonight or tomorrow, where she also directs the Museum of Anthropology. Shannon earned a master's degree in public archaeology from the University of Memphis in 2000 and a PhD from University of California, Davis in 2009. She joined the WAZU, or WSU faculty, in 2013, where she's had a very productive early career, with 4 books and more than 40 journal articles or book chapters already to her credit. Shannon's research focuses on the archaeology of hunter-gatherer fisher peoples in Western North America, including the historical ecology of marine environments along the Pacific coast, and the use of ceremonial and medicinal psychoactive plants among cultures around the world. She worked closely with contemporary indigenous peoples in Northwest California, the Columbia Plateau, and the Great Basin. Her research on colonialism, Native American persistence after the gold rush, and the formation of Indian white households in the frontier West has been particularly influenced by her work with descendant tribal communities. As you can see tonight, she's going to talk about the use of psychoactive substances by people in the past, which should be particularly interesting here in the city of Eugene. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Shannon.
Thank you for having me here. It's just a real pleasure to be. I really admire this museum very much and the faculty, and I've enjoyed my day here so far. Thank you very much. And will you kill me if I say go Cougs? Probably. Okay. So never mind. Okay. Don't say it here. So I'm here today to talk about the archaeology of psychoactive plants, and this is a fun topic. It's something that I've been working on since about 2003. And I want to share with you today some of my research, particularly on the archaeological science of alkaloids. Some of the biomolecular work I'm doing. Can you hear me in the background or back there? Just let me know if you can't hear me. I'm going to present a few of my research. Having trouble hearing me? A few of my studies on pipe research and human dental calculus, which is something that's a new horizon in psychoactive plant studies. And then I'll talk a little bit about some current and future directions in these realms. So for psychoactive plants, and what I define, how I define psychoactive plants, or how they're defined, is basically they're plants that they contain alkaloids. These are toxic chemical compounds that are produced in certain plants all over the world, and these are toxic compounds that have evolved over huge time scales in many cases. And plants produce alkaloids to basically as a defense mechanism against insects, against herbivores, against pathogens. And when it comes down to it, humans discovered very early on that some of those plants have very pleasing properties. So humans tend to like psychoactive plants, alkaloid-bearing plants. And many of these are classified into compounds that are stimulating, hallucinogenic. They can also be depressants. And we have a very long history. People know a lot about these plants. And probably there are very few, if any of us in this room, that have not been touched by these plants in some way. Either because we enjoy them or we have loved ones that have been affected by the use of tobacco or other psychoactive plants. And actually, if you think about it, archaeology can give us a really long-term perspective on how these dynamics work. So we are used to talking about these dynamics on huge time scales, and I think it is actually quite surprising to a lot of people to learn about the history of use of a lot of these plants. And there are many of these popular drugs that are used today have extremely ancient use or ancient history. Marijuana has been used by people in Eurasia for 3,000 years. Tobacco has been used for probably up to 10,000 years or more. And this is something that has fascinated anthropologists for many years. Psychoactive plant use has this very interesting aspect to it in traditional societies. There's many ceremonies that are wrapped around psychoactive plant use. So you have Native American tobacco ceremonies. The Native American church actually has a peyote ceremony. Black drink ceremonies in the southeastern United States, and it goes on and on. So anthropologists have been very interested in this kind of behavior, this information, and there's really this ritual. There's vision quest, there's ceremonialism that goes along with traditional use of psychoactive plants. And so when you started thinking about modern use today and how a lot of these plants have had global health impacts, it's just amazing, how deep in time these substances go. And it kind of gives you a really good perspective on why they're so addicted to human beings, because these relationships have evolved over so many years. So, as John was saying, I am an archaeologist that specializes in Western North America. I'm very interested in hunter-gatherer fishers, and a lot of my work has been focused with psychoactives on understanding use in the Americas. And these are some of the popular psychoactive plants that are used in the Americas. And so you may have heard, most people have heard tobacco or datura, some of these other hallucinogenic materials, caffeinated drinks. Who doesn't love chocolate? Chocolate has Amerindian roots. There's also, there's certain toads, if you lick them, they have bufatoxins, and that will create hallucinogenic reactions in human beings, and there's all sorts of things like that. I've never tried that, I don't know, but that's what I'm told. Peyote, all sorts of interesting things. And if you start looking at the anthropology of human use of these plants, now people are really creative about how they take drugs. And there's all kinds of ways to take these things. So you think about smoking tobacco. Well, people also drink tobacco. And not just tobacco, all these other substances. So snuffing, eating, licking, intestinal absorption by enema. So this was this very happy man up here is giving himself a tobacco enema. That's from the Maya area. So it's just kind of fascinating. And so the archaeology. So tracking the archaeological roots of these behaviors and the use of these plants is really fascinating, and for archaeologists it can actually be quite challenging. We are used to, we work with material culture as archaeologists, and so if we find certain artifacts, we often equate those artifacts with psychoactive plant use. Pipes are a particularly straightforward example. There's also some special pots and ceremonial shell vessels that we think are associated with certain types of plants. These are some wooden snuff trays from northern Chile that are associated with a snuff called Anadenthera. It's a hallucinogenic plant. And also you can now start looking at human remains, so dental calculus and human hair. There's some of the compounds associated with these plants are actually remain in some human substances. But there's some limitations with these things, because pipes, for example, you don't know really what people were necessarily smoking. You might assume that they were smoking tobacco, but that's not necessarily true because things have changed over time. So there's all sorts of examples of complications and difficulties with this kind of work. The archaeological science of alkaloids, so using biomarkers, plant biomarkers, and identifying these plant biomarkers using chemical techniques, so gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, liquid chromatography, mass spectrometry, and that sort of thing, has been an emerging field that really has a lot of promise. So basically what happens is archaeologists will often pair up with chemists who are interested in this sort of thing. I, for example, work with, I don't have a background in chemistry or anything like that, but I work with people that are interested in the chemistry of medicinal plants. And so a lot of these studies are interdisciplinary, and some of the earliest ones, some of the earliest studies started occurring in the early 2000s. And there was an archaeologist named Sean Rafferty, who in 2002 identified the compound nicotine in some of the ash content of some of these complete pipes from eastern North America, so the eastern woodlands where people were farming. I have to say that finding a pipe with the residue inside of it is actually that's quite uncommon. So that was a pretty wonderful study, and so he showed that we could do this. And then there were some early studies finding the use of cacao, associating the use of cacao with certain vessels in Honduras and Central America. So those studies occurred right around the time I was doing my dissertation, and this is when I started getting into this research. I actually did my research in Del Norte County, California, my dissertation research. I worked with the Tolowa communities in that area near Crescent City. And so I was working right down here. It's this wonderful area in Jen Smith State Park. And I was interested in the evolution of plank houses. So when did these plank houses first emerge along the rivers in this area? It's really kind of a similar area to here. So there's Eugene in the study area. And I'm afraid I shouldn't put this on here because, So just to show you, here's Pullman, And by the way, Pullman is going crazy right now. I don't know if you know this, but the sports thing, what is the sports? ESPN? Game Day, yes. And they are coming to Pullman, and people are freaking out. Our town it's a town of 30,000, 20,000 students, and it's supposed to have over 100,000 people, and people are literally freaking out. So it's going to be fun. I'll be here. But so anyhow, that was a little segue. But my research was really looking at the evolution of these plank houses, and when did people start living in them? And there were these really fascinating structures. This is a rendering of one of the houses we found, this wonderful plank house with an internal paved area and that sort of thing. And this is what we think it looked like. This is an artist rendering. Anyhow, we found a lot of a lot of artifacts in there, including this little guy, and that is this archaeological pipe. It's funny how life is. You get sort of, I didn't really intend to get into psychoactive plant studies, but then I found this pipe, and the rest is just I went down this rabbit hole of psychoactive plants. And so this beautiful pipe, this is made out of soapstone or steatite. This is just a gorgeous, gorgeous pipe. It was something that the Tolowa that I worked with were really interested in. They still use tobacco in a lot of their ceremonies. Tobacco is still a really important plant. Lots of people smoke cigarettes, but it's also an important plant ceremonially. And so I started learning more and more about these pipes, and I discovered we actually found 2 pipes in this house. And this is the whole one I just showed you, and then there was this other one. And I found out, as I started researching this and talking to people, it was pretty common for people to have paired pipes, to sort of kind of hang on to 2 pipes, and wasn't that interesting? And then a lot of tobacco use in this area revolved around male sweat house practices. So people were commonly tobacco users, and they would, and that would be an activity that men would engage in when they were sweating in sweat baths and that sort of thing. It had this religious aspect to it. And in some cases, it's said that with world renewal ceremonies, if tobacco was not used, the whole ceremony would go to heck, and basically, the world would not be renewed. It was that integral to the culture. And this is a ethnographic. This picture, I think, is from the right around the late 1800s. Chief John is a Hoopa man, and he's in front of his sweat house here with his big, wonderful paving stones. And right there, if you look very closely, that's a tobacco plant. That's a Nicotiana tobacco plant. So, I started learning about tobacco, and then I also started discovering, well, it wasn't just tobacco. Like, I assumed, this means they were smoking tobacco 1,100 years ago. And actually, if you start looking at it, people smoked all kinds of stuff. It wasn't just tobacco. And so if you look up this ethnobotany book, we found mention of over 100 different smoke plants. Many of them were tobacco, and tobacco was indeed the most popular plant throughout the Americas, the most popular smoke plant, but we don't really know for how long. There's still some open questions about that. Its use definitely was widespread at contact, especially when you get into the West, it's kind of interesting because you remember people are not, they're not farming, but this was a special plant for a lot of people. They did cultivate tobacco, and we're learning more and more that people did really manage their environment. We used to think about hunter-gatherers as they only, sort of were passive users of the plants and animals that were here, but we're sort of evolving our ideas and learning that, no, that's not true. People really did have mastery over their environment. And so, of course, tobacco, it's psychotropic alkaloids that we look for when we're looking for the chemical signatures of this plant are nicotine, nornicotine, cotinine. It's a stimulant. It's got mind-altering effects. If you actually ingest enough tobacco, I do not recommend this, but you can start hallucinating. So don't do that. You can also die if you have too much tobacco. The proposed sequence of tobacco use into Western North America, we think that domesticated tobacco originated down in South America, probably in the basically in the Andes area, and it traveled up into the Caribbean, into Eastern North America. That farming cultures in this area were using tobacco. They were planting it along with maize, beans, and squash. Some people think that tobacco was the first domesticate in the Americas. That's an interesting idea. That people think about domestication and agriculture, and they don't always think about tobacco. They think about the food plants. So it's kind of interesting. In the Western United States, hunter-gatherers were, for the most part, using indigenous or wild tobaccos. People often will say they're wild, but they were really, people were cultivating these plants, and so I prefer to call them indigenous. I have their wild, but they're indigenous tobaccos all throughout the Western United States. And there's some overlap in the Southwest where people are also using domesticated tobacco. Now, what's interesting about tobacco is when you get into this area and further north, we think that it would have been hard. Tobaccos, these indigenous tobaccos really like dry, deserty climates. So there's probably some sort of human manipulation that's associated with these plants. And if you look at this, this is ethnohistoric documentation of tobacco use. This is up in Haida. This is the Queen Charlotte Islands off the coast of British Columbia. That's pretty amazing. That's pretty far north. There's some evidence that, at contact, people were cultivating small gardens in that area. So again, tobacco was this important plant. And then, I also learned about sort of the differences between these different tobaccos. There's lots of different tobacco species. The ones that are in modern cigarettes that are smoked today are derived from these domesticated varieties, Nicotiana rustica, Nicotiana tabacum. Those are the ones that Christopher Columbus first encountered when he met the Arawak Indians in 1492, whatever that. And then quickly thereafter, this plant was people, Europeans loved it, and they brought it over to Europe, and it spread just all over the world and had global health consequences. It was pretty much all over the place by the 1500s, 1600s. But in the West, people were using various indigenous tobaccos, and these are the ones, they're sort of, you may have seen them around in gardens, or they sprout up here and there, especially along sort of sandy bars around rivers. This is Nicotiana quadrivalgus. This is one that is kind of in this area. They're weedier plants, and they have a lower nicotine content. So if you compare the nicotine content of domesticated tobaccos versus these wild or indigenous tobaccos, it's much, much higher. This is how much nicotine these plants contain. And that's probably a consequence of human manipulation. Over many years, people really dialed in on these. They liked nicotine, so that did affect these plants over many, many years. When we're looking at ancient use of tobacco, again, this can be difficult because we rely upon pipes and archaeobotanical seeds. Sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find these very small seeds in archaeological contexts. But people did smoke using other things. People had cigars, they rolled tobacco, they had reed cigarettes. Those things are perishable, and we will not find those in the archaeological record. People will also chew tobacco as well. That was, so that could be complicated. But these chemical analyses do kind of take on, this archaeological science can bring us to new horizons with this work. And so the studies that I got involved with were supported by the National Science Foundation Archaeometry Program. And we just finished this study this year. David Gang, who's an analytical chemist at Washington State, and Yelmer Erkans at UC Davis, who was on my committee back when I was doing my dissertation research. And what I learned was it's not as easy. You think you can just bring the pipe to the chemist and tell me what's in here, and it's not that easy. I wish it was. But what I learned was that the combustion process really affects the chemistry of what is left over and what we hope to find in these archaeological pipes. So we have to go through this whole experimental archaeology process. And that involved basically us experimentally smoking. This is an experimental clay pipe. Many, many different plants, not just tobacco, but to see what those chemical signatures were, and then we would characterize those experimental plants, those experimental pipes, and then we would see if this fingerprint basically matched what we would find in the archaeological pipes. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Did I explain that okay? All right, so that was kind of our experimental approach, and that's what we've taken throughout. And this looks like really low, it's totally low tech, but this took me forever to figure out how to do this. I basically got a vise from this is high science right here. We stuck the pipe in the vise, and I found these pipes from Civil War reenactment websites that you could buy these very cheaply online, and just connected a large syringe to mimic the tobacco smoking. And attached it with heat shrink tubing, and we would mimic the sort of bellowing properties of smoking a pipe. I did visit a group of chemists down in Chile, and they were doing similar things to us. And they said, well, you know how we did it? What we did was basically passed out a bunch of pipes and had our graduate students smoke. You can't do that here. Sing it. But they did it quickly, a little bit more quickly than we did. And so basically, this is just a picture of what is left inside of the pipe. And that was kind of, if you're a smoker, you're just like, oh man, this is really bad for me. So you section these artifacts, and then we go ahead and then we can compare that chemistry to the archaeological pipes. So for this first study that I was involved with, that pipe that I was telling you about from my dissertation sites that I found inside of the Plank House, we did identify nicotine in all of these pipes. And what is really, one thing that we really wanted to do was develop techniques that would work with really small specimens, not just these complete pipes. So this is like really uncommon to find in a complete pipe. But this is what we usually find. These are centimeter, these are just centimeters, little tiny pieces. And so we developed a process. Basically what we did was you soak these little pieces in a little bit of water and chemical solvent, and you use a sonicating machine, which is sound waves basically. And it basically just like your Sonicare toothbrush, that's the same idea, that it will sort of excite the molecules and then extract them from the artifacts. And these are all post test. This is after testing, so the artifacts remain intact. We don't have to destroy the artifacts, and we wanted to do that because we wanted to develop techniques that other archaeologists could apply, and they would do that. So this was exciting, and we documented tobacco use back to AD 860 in northwestern California. After coming to Washington State, with my research, I was really interested when you start getting further north into the Northwest, you start getting outside of the natural range of tobacco. And I'm really fascinated with the idea of human manipulation of plants and animals. And you start thinking about, well, these people were probably cultivating, or maybe they were trading, if they were using tobacco in this area, this would be a really fascinating place to look. And so as director of the Museum of Anthropology, we have a lot of collections with pipes in them. And one of the first things I had a graduate student do was map out where all of the pipes have been found in the plateau and sort of northern Pacific Northwest. And I don't think we have all of them from the border. There's quite a few up here in British Columbia, and here we are on the Snake River. The red is just signifies collections that are in the Museum of Anthropology at Washington State, and the blue are not. So they're fairly widespread, but remember, this is just 1 or 2 pipes per site, so they're actually pretty rare to find pipes. But we've looked so far at about 45 archaeological pipes throughout the Northwest, up into British Columbia, the Mount Rainier area, and then Washington and Idaho State. But the one study I want to tell you about is how am I doing on time? Am I okay?
6 o'clock.
I'm okay? Okay. Just tell me to shut up. It's this collaboration with the Nez Perce tribe, and the Nez Perce are a tribal community that they have ancestral territory in Washington State, Idaho, Montana, this whole area in the plateau up into Canada. Washington State University is part of is on their ancestral territory. And they came to me, we started having conversations about tobacco use, and they were very interested in this, and they said, well, we would really like to document our ancestral tobacco use. And one of the reasons we want to do this is because we're invested in these tobacco systems. Actually, there's all sorts of tobacco abatement programs that are going on, but they seem to work in with a lot of people. But with this is not a good sign. Just trust me on this. Alaskan Native Alaskans and American Indians tend to have persistently high tobacco use rates. And there have been studies from the National Institute of Health and other health professionals that are starting to discover that traditional tobacco cessation programs, the scare tactics that are like tobacco is bad, and they don't really seem to work with a lot of Native American communities. And part of this might be because tobacco has a sacred history with them, and it has a special meaning to them. So if you tell culturally saying, no, this is a very powerful, important plant to us, that stuff is not tending to work. However, what does tend to work is when you sort of start talking about colonial tobacco, commercial tobacco, and contrasting it with traditional use of tobacco, indigenous tobaccos, using tobacco as an offering, not as a sort of everyday addictive plant. That seems to work, and it just brought in after trade. So like by Hudson Bay company traders and that sort of thing. We do have sporadic evidence in the Northwest. There's some early documentation of pre-trade tobacco being used. So there's this Scottish botanist named David Douglas who traveled through the Northwest. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of him, but he's Douglas Fir. What his name? You guys have heard of him. So, okay. So this is one of his herbarium specimens that's located at Kew Gardens, a tobacco plant, and he did, he did encounter tobacco among some tribal communities, especially down in the Lower Columbia. This is a sketch from Lewis and Clark fame of an early pipe. So we think, if this was at contact, this was probably signifies indigenous use of tobacco prior to contact. And to make a long story short, we tested 16 pipes, all dating back to about 3,000 years ago. And yes, they did smoke tobacco. We found tobacco or nicotine signatures in 12 or so pipes from all of these sites in the Snake River and the Columbia River. And we have really good evidence that people were smoking tobacco for at least 1,300 years before trade tobacco. We did not find any chemical signatures associated with the plant Archaeological uva-ursi or bearberry, which we were actually expecting. And so right now these archaeological pipe studies are, I said, we've looked at about 45 pipes from the area, and the red marks here are basically, the red dots are where we found nicotine positive pipes. There have been pipes, about 45 pipes that we tested in British Columbia, and also Western Washington State, the Pasco area, which is in central Washington State, and we haven't found nicotine in any of those plants. We are finding lots of compounds, but we can't figure out what they were smoking yet. We're working on it. So that's to be determined. They were smoking something, but we don't know what yet. So that's been fun. The new sort of horizon for me recently is looking at human dental calculus. So you look at the pipes, and the pipes are great. You can learn a lot from pipes, but they're rare, and also they're not always associated with a particular individual. Sometimes you'll find them with a burial, but generally speaking, we don't really work with artifacts from human burials. But if you look at human dental calculus, there's some tribal communities that are really interested in these studies. This is kind of a new frontier. So do you guys know what dental calculus is? I'm sorry, I should probably say that. It's basically dental plaque. It's mineralized dental plaque. So if you go for a root planing, it's like the worst thing in the world. For a deep teeth cleaning, there's stuff that is mineralized on your teeth, and that we find that material on the teeth of ancient skeletons as well. And so when you have that kind of material, you can start talking about these dynamics about plant use. Some people are looking at ancient DNA. They're looking at signatures of disease in certain individuals, cortisol levels, all kinds of really cool stuff. And you can look at these things on, what was going on between males versus females, different age groups, different status groups, and all kinds of things. So this is, in my view, a real new frontier. It's an exciting frontier. And not all Native communities kind of are interested in this information, but there's the Ohlone, there's a group of Ohlone from the San Francisco Bay Area who really wanted to see these studies. And so we looked at a lot of, we've been looking at a lot of dental calculus samples from males and females. And the ethnographic story here is that it was mostly males. So anthropologists that would study Native Californians would say, okay, well, it's mostly males that are smoking. Some females did, but they were generally old women, and then you find out they're like 40, and I'm like, really, but or they'd be shaman or something like this. So these special people, And here's a wonderful picture of a Yokich woman smoking a pipe around 1945. She's holding a pipe in her hand there. But basically what the archaeological data are showing, we published this paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science Reports recently, that shows, first of all, that these alkaloids remain in human dental calculus. We just wanted to see, can we do it? Does this stuff persist? And the answer is yes, tobacco. If you're a smoker, that stuff persists in your dental cavity. And now we're starting to look at more and more individuals. And what we're discovering is that we now have about 150 specimens that we've looked at. If you divide them into males and females, about 15% of the males are positive for nicotine. 55% of the females are positive for nicotine. Now, I don't want to make a big deal out of that, but it's very interesting, and that's something that I want to kind of tease out.
You're talking about old teeth. Is that what you're talking about?
I'm talking about archaeological teeth.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how old are they?
How old are they? We've looked at dental calculus from burials as old as 3,000 years old. The only ones that we have identified tobacco in are about 500 years old. Does that answer your question? Okay. Sorry if I wasn't clear about that. Yeah, archaeological samples. And so I'm actually really excited about this. And that's sort of where I'm going right now. I'm hoping to work some more on the dental calculus samples. Now, one of the things that's kind of funny about this, and this kind of actually relates to your question, because we started thinking like, you know, with the pipes, you've got to have this whole experimental thing, like what's going on with the pipes, and we can mimic this. Well, we can't give a bunch of graduate students psychoactive plants and then take their calculus and then go and test it.
Yes, you can.
Well, so
We got dental school.
the dental school, yes. So the University of Washington partnered with the University of Washington, and they have a Department of Periodontics. They have an in-place IRB, which is wonderful, which means it's a human subjects. They can do research with human subjects. And as long as we can't connect our samples with specific individuals, we can do the research on those modern samples. And so now we're trying to see, can we find these, what's going on with these, the modern samples? How long do these alkaloids persist? We're also interested in whether cannabinoids persist in dental calculus. And at first we were like, oh, well, we'll write to we'll work with the University of Washington, and hopefully we'll get a few samples of cannabis users. Well, they're all like cannabis users. And then we also have identified methamphetamine and opioids and that sort of thing. So there is this kind of, pardon? Coffee. Yeah, actually, it's kind of, yes, we're finding caffeine in everybody. Everybody's got caffeine. So we're trying to understand these dynamics. We're trying to model these dynamics, and it is really important to try and do the best you can with modern samples to understand how these dynamics work. And I think that there's a lot of possibilities here. So you do find burials with cannabis shrouds in China. This is an example. Perhaps we could identify I'll just back up. This individual here was a male that was found with all kinds of cannabis plants over him, and they assumed that meant that he was a tobacco smoker. Or was he just a really exciting frontier here with these kind of studies? I think I'm just excited about it. So I hope I explained everything.